why is it important that we understand what's going on in the world economy? Has anyone got any ideas at all? Why is that important? Yes?
It'll ultimately funnel into your regional.
Exactly, that's the answer. It will funnel into you on a personal level, because a lot of times what happens is if the US dollar was to continue to collapse and go lower and lower and lower, which is possible, and I'm going to talk about that, what could ultimately happen is the price of a gallon of gas could go from $3 a gallon to $6 or $7 a gallon. And then all of a sudden what happens with a lot of Americans, they get very upset, they get very angry, and they blame Obama. Well, it has very little to do, well, a little bit to do with Obama, but it has to do more with what's going on in the world economy. So you very much have to be linked to what's going on in the world economy to understand what's actually happening. Now, another question I want to ask is, there's some Canadians in the room. Raise your hand if you're Canadian, proudly Canadian. I am too. I am too. Why is it so important that we understand what's going on in the United States? Right, you're a good student, Joe. Actually 80% of our exports go to the United States, and that basically is a large part of about 50% plus of the Canadian economy, because over 50%, well over 50% of the economy in Canada is in Quebec and Ontario. And the number one driving industry there is the manufacturing and export market to the United States. So that's why it's so important. When I talk a lot about what's going on today about the United States, I know a lot of times Canadians get frustrated because they say, why are we always talking about the United States? Why do we have to be so ethnocentric? Well, the reason why is because, let's look at it right now. If we take a country, a lot of the emerging nations right now are in double-digit growth. That means their economy is growing by more than 10% per year. Whereas in Canada, we're doing well through a commodities boom, but we're still under 3% for the year. That's because we're so closely tied to the United States. That's one of the big reasons why. Now, what I'm going to do today is, I never take things, because I realize you have to talk to the audience who you're in front of. And this audience is a little bit more sophisticated than the average public who are out there, yet it's not a room of economists. So I have to balance what's going to make sure that you get the maximum take-home value today when I'm speaking with you. So there's no point in talking to a room as if they all have their PhD in economics. So the most important thing I can do is give you take-home value today, and that's exactly what I want to do, because I haven't done my job up here if you're not able to take notes, you're not able to understand, and then not able to go home and put those action steps in place for yourself. So the whole idea today for me to be up here is to be able to give you something so that you can go home and apply it and take action steps for yourself. So I'm going to talk about what's actually gone on in the last month, and then how that relates to you who are here right now today. Now, what happened just a couple of weeks ago that was so big here in the United States? There's two really major things, but what's one of the two? Okay, the election. And in the election, what did we see happen? In general terms? Return to conservatism. And what exactly does that mean, return to conservatism?
We're not going to spend as much money in the government as we have.
Okay, he's saying we're not going to spend as much money as we did before. But how can you say that? The Democrats are still in charge of the Senate, and Obama is still the president. Okay, that's not for you to answer. That's just, but it's a general question that's out there. You see, what they refer to the session right now, what they refer to the session right now is a lame duck presidency. Okay, and what we have is we have the House, the Congress, which is controlled by the Republicans, and it was the biggest swing vote that we've seen since 1948. 60 additional seats went to the Republicans. And of course, the Democrats are still in charge of the Senate. But here's the big thing, and this is why it's so important to everyone in the room, because I'm going to relate the election to China. Okay? Let me just, because in the United States, we always embrace democracy as the best system, but I'm just going to give us a little bit to think about today. What can literally happen? A lot of Tea Party people were elected. Who are the Tea Party? Someone tell me briefly in a couple of words, what does the Tea Party mean? Yeah?
Basically trying to get government to be smaller and out of personal decisions of people.
Right, and a little bit more right-wing.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, the fact is, with that going on, it's going to be very difficult for Obama to reach out to Congress and work with Congress, because the Tea Party is basically, they have a big say now in Congress, and they are going to fight all the way through to say, look, no more spending, we want to cut government. Now, if that happens, if we look at an impasse, and an impasse happens, the next 2 years in the United States, very little will occur. Okay? So that's why it's so important. Now, the problem, this is one thing I just want us to reflect upon. In the United States, we have elections every 2 years. Every 2 years. That means that our politicians are gearing up to be re-elected in 2 years. Is it possible that sometimes we could make decisions based on what's best in 2 years to get re-elected, as opposed to what's best in 50 years for the overall society? Are we starting to get an idea why we can't always be so focused on the United States and democracy as the best system in the world? There are other systems. For example, when the Chinese, when they make a decision, it's based upon 30, 40, 50 years. I know that they just bought a mine down in South America, and they've done it based on a 100-year cycle. There's no way that type of decision would ever be made here. So that's why all of a sudden, when history reflects back upon what's happening here in the United States, I think what's going to happen over time is they're going to say, well, democracy eventually became a less competitive system when we compared it to other emerging nations around the world. Sometimes leaders have to be put in place to lead, and not always through plebiscite and what's best for or what the constituents want. Sometimes you just have to step up to the plate and you have to lead. So that was one big story that happened. Now, someone else tell me, what's the other? There's a few of them, but what's another really big story that happened? You've been a great student, but I'm going to get a few more. Yes. Okay, and we're going to talk about that. Yeah, what's the other one? But before what's happening in Ireland in the last few days, what's another really big, massive story? Yeah, what's that? The $600 billion. And what did they do with that $600 billion? What's that $600 billion allocated towards? 10-year, that's great. Yeah, Joe, 10-year bonds. And why are they buying 10-year bonds? Prop up the dollar and keep interest rates low. Because what's happening right now in the United States is, if they put up a treasury auction, because what happens is the feds have auctions a few times a week here, and when they have auctions, what happens is they'll do an auction for 1-year bonds, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, and 10 years. Well, if there's no buyers for the bonds in the United States, that means they can't fund their own debt. So what do the feds do to fund or to make sure that the bonds are always purchased in the United States? What do? For some of you, this is going to shock you. They print money. They print their own money to buy their own bonds to pay for their own debt. Do you kind of have an understanding why now the value of the US dollar gets debased? Do you have an understanding why there's less confidence in the US dollar? Because there's more and more and more money being printed to buy these bonds to pay for the debt in the United States. Now, what does that actually refer to? What's the fancy 2 words? Quiet, Joe. What's the fancy 2 words?
QE.
quantitative easing. Very good. My friend from Kamloops got that one. The Canadian, yes. So it's called quantitative easing. That's all it is. That's the simplest way to break it down. So the $600 billion that has been put aside, what happened? This is interesting. Did Obama make that decision? No. To print who made the decision? The Feds. The Feds made the decision to print $600 billion. Because the Fed said, look, with the election happening, if we don't do this, and they did it right before the election, if we don't do this right now with the Republicans coming in with a much stronger voice, we're going to have a heck of a lot tougher time later on. So that's why Bernanke stepped up to the plate and did it right before the election. Now, what happened when they announced quantitative easing? What happened in the stock market? The stock market went up. Why did the stock market go up? Well, hey, that's great. That's the right answer. Why did the stock market go up? Someone tell me. Injection of cash, but? Come on. There's one real key reason that's been driving this whole stock market rally. What's it been? Come on. What? No, not confidence. Kind of confidence. What is it? Okay. Let me give you a hint. The last 4,000 trading sessions that I've studied, there's a direct relationship. When the US dollar goes down by more than 1%, the market rallies. When the US dollar goes up by more than 1%, the market collapses on that day. No, the whole point is that what happens is the more money you print, the more the US dollar falls, because people say, look, that's funny money. That you're creating more circulation of money. You're just artificially creating money that's not backed by anything. That's why gold goes up, because gold is the #1 hard asset on the planet. So when people buy gold, they're saying, I don't have confidence in the US dollar. Because the reserve currency of this world right now is still the US dollar. The Romans were the reserve currency for a few hundred years. The Spanish were for 100 years. The French were for 100 years. The British were for 100 years. The Americans are just about at 100 years, and it's declining now. What do you think is going to be the next world currency? Well, you can say gold, but there's not enough of it. What? China. China is starting to do things around the world where instead of they do transactions whereby it's not paid in US dollars. You know, I heard one very, very interesting thesis that instead of using gold as the reserve currency, or to gold to back any currency in the world, someone had thought, well, maybe what the Chinese are doing, because they're buying so much copper around the world, is they're going to back their currency with copper. Because copper is the barometer of the world health and the world economy. So that was kind of interesting. Certainly possible. Now, not only, I'll take some questions at the end, or I'm actually going to be around a lot of the day so you can interact with me, because I've got a lot to get through. Now, not only, what did they call that? They called it quantitative easing 2. Okay? Because before that we had the TARP and a number of other government stimulus packages and bailouts. But then after that we also had, what did they announce on QE2 when they said, look, we're going to use $75 billion a month for the next several months, up to $600 billion to buy 10-year bonds so that there's demand there to buy them, thereby keeping interest rates low. So what did the Feds announce at the same time? This also caused the market to surge and go up. Does anyone else, do you remember what? You had to read it. You had to read it. And I know a lot of you wouldn't want to read those because, frankly, they are dry. But what they announced is they may not stop at QE2. They may continue with QE3.